stand alongside, thank you, Progress Michigan, because we know that right now our public schools, they're being threatened right now by the new administration. My name is Imani Foster. I'm a founding member of 482 Forward's Youth Collective and also currently the Deputy Director of Communications and Research at 482 Forward. We are a coalition of parents, of students, of school staff, community advocate, and so many different organizations across Detroit that are committed to making sure that every child has access to an equitable and a life-preparing education. From a WWE CEO pick to lead the Department of Education to the possible destruction of that very department and so many other funds that support our most vulnerable students, we know that it's time for us to say no and to fight back. So today, Michigan parents, students, teacher unions, school board leadership, state leadership, and grassroots organizers, we're all uniting against the destruction of our public schools that's really happening before our very eyes. Today, we are going to call on our congressional delegation to stand up and to fight back against policies that we know would hurt Michigan students, to stop business as usual. Please prepare to hear stories about how our lives will change with such a drastic shift to how we fund our schools, how our lawmakers are interpreting these new developments, and how they're planning to fight back for us in Lansing and our school districts, as well as what you can do to protect Michigan schools. Today, who you can plan to hear from are State Representative Regina Weiss, Rochelle Crow-Hercher, who is the co-director of the Michigan Education Justice Coalition, which we call MEJC, and also a Macomb mom of two, State Superintendent of our Michigan Public School Board, Michael Rice, Terrence Martin, who is the president of AFT Michigan, M.A. Zanotti, who is with Equality Michigan, Sandra Ducky, who is the president of the Ferndale Public School Board, and Monet Harris, who is a 482 Forward parent organizer from Detroit. And also, like I said, she's a parent, so we have to say that. Before we get into our speakers, a little bit of Zoom etiquette. As you may see, we have this very, very, very locked down. You cannot unmute yourself, and we don't have a chat open. This is because we want to be very focused on the message at hand. We want to make sure that everyone has an ability to hear everything, to participate fully, and to take all the notes that they need. If you need to communicate with us, if you have a question, please feel free to use the Q&A box. We will address the Q&A box at the end, and we will take the questions kind of as they're received, parsing through them a little bit to make sure that we prioritize any questions that haven't been answered already. If you are with a news station, please make sure that you put your publication in your name. And also when you say your question in the chat, maybe just throw your publication at the end of it so we can know who's asking what questions. That is all that I have for any Zoom etiquette before we get started. Molly, anything that you would like to add? No. All right. So with that being said, we are going to go to our first speaker, who is State Representative Regina Weiss. Thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Thank you so much, Amani. And thank you to 482 Forward, to Progress Michigan, to every person who's on the call and everyone who has turned in today to hear this important message about what is going on right now in our schools. So good morning. I am Regina Weiss. I'm the state representative for the 5th House District. I serve the communities of Oak Park, Royal Oak Township, and also Northwest Detroit. Before I was elected to office, I worked as a teacher in the Detroit public school system. And during my time as a teacher, I saw firsthand how students depend on the many, many services that are provided and managed through the Department of Education, including extra supports for students with special education needs and students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. And we all know that several students in Michigan and across our country need extra support in order to learn and achieve their potential. For years, the Department of Ed has worked to ensure that these students are provided with the same opportunities that every child in our country deserves. And if that department were to close or has been threatened or its funding is reduced, there will need to be serious work done at the state level to ensure that these students and families their needs continue to be met. We've also heard the threats and have already seen the horrific executive orders that have come down, including one that came out at the end of January, targeting our public school systems and some of the most vulnerable students and children in our state. Without critical federal funding that is very well needed, I fear that a lot of the services that are currently being provided to children and that families rely on is at serious risk of going away. The federal government provides over $2 billion currently to Michigan for education. Our schools are already underfunded here in Michigan, with many districts struggling to retain talented educators or maintain basic infrastructure repairs or improvements. The federal government honestly has historically underfunded states in providing, for example, in providing special education services through the IDEA Act. The federal promise was always to fund states at a 40% level, and currently the funding is right around 10%. And while that is not adequate, we are concerned about what may happen to that level of funding moving forward. And we've already seen a lot of the chaos that has ensued around the federal spending freeze order. And with the potential loss of critical federal dollars, we will be hard pressed to even maintain the insufficient funding level we currently have, and it will be impossible to close both the funding and achievement gaps between districts. Last term, I was privileged to serve as chair of the House K-12 education budget here in Michigan, and I'm proud of the work that we did in moving the needle in order to provide quality education here in Michigan, from the implementation of the Opportunity Index to providing help to districts with transportation costs, implementing universal school meals, as well as fully funding the Special Education Foundation Allowance for the first time. All of these programs here in Michigan and more could be at risk if our education budget is forced to shrink due to the loss or the threatened loss of federal funds. While this uncertainty around the future of education in our state and our country is disheartening, I am encouraged by the diverse coalition here today that I know will fight to stop our education system from sliding back. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, State Representative Weiss. Thank you for just being a great example of an ally, and really speaking truth to what we know, which is that we already aren't fully funded, right? What we were guaranteed and promised from the federal government. And so, like, imagine if we don't have what we already have been promised. So I appreciate you, State Rep Weiss, and I am going to pass it on next to the co-director of the Michigan Education Justice Coalition, and also a mother in Macomb, Rochelle Crow-Hercher. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, everyone, and good morning. As Amani said, I am Rochelle Crow-Hercher and the co-director of the Michigan Education Justice Coalition. But more importantly, I am a mom of 2 daughters that attend Utica Community Schools. Both of my children have received special education services for speech, and my oldest daughter also has ADHD. When my oldest daughter was in 1st grade, her teacher commented on how wonderful, kind, and smart she was, but that she noticed a hesitation and repeating herself more than normal when my daughter spoke. The teacher flagged an issue that I noticed in my daughter, but I didn't know that I needed to be concerned about. For the past 7 years, my daughter has received speech and language therapy in school. This wonderfully compassionate child now loves theater, choir, and debate, and all of that is due to her speech and language therapy. My youngest daughter, now in the 3rd grade, had a speech delay. When she was 3 years old, she began to receive speech therapy for her language delay from our local school district. Now she's the life of the party, constantly making jokes, and she never stops talking. Both of my children are flourishing because of the special education speech intervention they received from their public schools. Because of what my children went through, I became more involved. I wanted to make a difference. And I'm now the co-director of MEJC. There are children across Michigan and across the country that need that little bit of extra help to be their best selves. And I hear stories from parents across the state whose children have IEPs or receive special education services. And I hear about their concern of what is going to happen to special education if the Department of Education is dismantled. We know that it is because of IDEA and the funding from the Department of Education that children like ours are able to learn and thrive in public schools. It is the Department of Education that helps protect our students and their rights to a public education. And my concern continues to be for the civil rights of all children that are protected by the Department of Education. My other concern is that without funding, special education services will cease to exist for families like mine. So this is why the Michigan Education Justice Coalition and our community partners are calling for folks across the state to connect with others and learn and share more about these real impacts that things like this can have on families like mine and theirs. We invite folks to go to michiganedjustice.com and sign up to host a community conversation for those folks in your school district. And we will not stop with our community conversations and our advocacy and our organizing. We will keep fighting for full and equitable funding for all students in Michigan, no matter their zip code or abilities. And so don't be surprised if you see us in the halls of a Capitol building in Lansing and at the offices of our elected officials across our great state of Michigan.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. Absolutely love it and love the end of your message, right? This is not the moment for us to stop going to Lansing. This is the moment where y'all will see us more and more and more and more and more. And so thank you so much and appreciate you. I'm now going to pass it to our state superintendent of our Michigan School Board, Michael Rice. And I can't wait just a little bit about Michael Rice. If you guys don't know, we actually have city school boards, and then we have a state school board that kind of governs our city school boards. And so
Department of Education, not the school board, Department of Education.
Department of Education across Michigan. And so very excited for us to get to hear from State Superintendent Michael Rice.
Thank you, Imani. Good morning, everyone. Thanks to 482Forward and MEJC for organizing today's event. You're doing important work. I also want to appreciate my fellow speakers. You're putting yourselves out there on behalf of kids. To be direct, the president is not going to close the U.S. Department of Education. Such a decision would require an act of Congress, and the votes aren't there, if only because the American people aren't going to go along for the ride as they understand the harm. When all is said and done, more will be said than done on this issue and many others. The president will not annex Canada, buy Greenland, or close the U.S. Department of Education. That's the good news. The bad news is that the president will try to cut programs and protections for school children. At the end of the day, the issue will not be the threat to the existence of the U.S. Department of Education, though the department at its best is important in providing funding, guidance, and best practices in support of all children. The issue will be that the president, in his assault on the U.S. Department of Education, is in fact threatening the programs and protections of our children, and by extension, our children themselves. In this moment, as our other two speakers have said, we should be concerned with cuts in federal funding for students with disabilities. This federal funding, never more than 20% of the total special education expenditures nationally in the last 5 years, not close to the 40% pledged by Congress in 1975, could be decreased further. That would be an outrage. We should be concerned about cuts to Title I and other title programs for economically disadvantaged students, English learners, students experiencing homelessness, and migrant students, among others. We should be concerned about cuts to the national breakfast and lunch programs, though these are administered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, cuts that would harm our ability to feed all children in schools. We should be concerned with cuts to smaller programs as well, and onerous conditions that the president and others might try to impose on federal funding for local school districts. In these cuts, in these conditions, make no mistake about it, the president isn't trying to return control of schools to states and local districts, which have always been in charge of education. He's trying to exercise control over who is served and how, what gets taught, and what does not. At the end of the day, this will be a fight not over the existence of the U.S. Department of Education, but rather over the federal programs and protections that serve children across the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, State Superintendent, for definitely a necessary message, right? To not get caught in the weeds and caught up in the distractions, and to also think about what could it look like to lose so much funding. Thank you so much, Michael Rice. And now I am going to pass it to Terrence Martin, who is the president of AFT Michigan.
Good morning, colleagues, and good morning to all those who have joined us this morning. My name is Terrence Martin. I'm president of the American Federation of Teachers, Michigan. My role is to advocate for educators, support quality education for all students, and ensure that teachers have the resources and respect that they deserve. The proposed dismantling of programs within the Department of Education by President Trump poses significant threats to public education. From a teacher's perspective, this move undermines the very foundation of our education system by jeopardizing funding, support for special education, and critical programs that assist vulnerable student populations. It sends a message that education is not a priority, which demoralizes educators and negatively impacts the students' learning environments. The AFT Michigan is committed to mobilizing our members and communities. We are organizing advocacy campaigns, engaging in grassroots efforts, and collaborating with other education stakeholders to raise awareness about the importance of a strong public school system. We will also be pushing for enforcement of legislative measures at both the state and federal levels to protect our schools and its funding. This dismantling could have devastating effects, particularly on financial vulnerability, financially vulnerable school districts, particularly those districts in Black, Brown, and rural communities. These districts often rely heavily on federal funding to support essential programs and services. Without this support, we could see increased class sizes, reduction of services, which could certainly compromise student learning. The union could face challenges in negotiating contracts and advocating for our members if the funding landscape shifts dramatically. The community plays a critical role in advocating for education. I urge parents, students, and community members to get involved. Attend school board meetings, voice your concerns to local representatives, and support initiatives that promise equitable funding for all schools. Building coalitions with local organizations can amplify our message and ensure that education remains a priority in our communities. Together, we can stand up for our students and teachers and fight for quality education that we all deserve. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Terrence. And I think just a great example of what coalition building actually looks like. I remember being a student and working with Terrence. And now I'm still here and Terrence is still here. And so just great to continue to be able to work with you and just fight for the public schools that we know our students deserve. So thank you. Next, I am going to pass it to, let me just make sure. I'm going to pass it to MA from Equality Michigan Action Network. And thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Really appreciate all of the sentiments and really just well thought out expressions that folks have shared already on the call today. So my name's Emmy Zanotti. Do want to share, I'm a proud graduate of public K-12 schools, come from a family of public school teachers and administrators. And I'm an organizer at the Equality Michigan Action Network, which seeks to protect and advance statewide equality for LGBTQ+ Michiganders. I don't think it's surprising to see the LGBTQ community represented on this call today. I think what our community, and especially transgender young people and their families, have endured in the first 20 days of this administration is nothing short of some of the eeriest, most dystopian sort of themes one could read even in a novel. We have families who have come to us because their kids have lost access to essential evidence-based gender-affirming healthcare. We have community members reaching out because the federal government is holding their passport applications along with official documents that were submitted alongside them. We have clinicians and providers reaching out because they're terrified of, and they know what will happen if they can no longer provide the services to these young people and adults even, if they can't continue to provide those services. It is simply chaos and confusion, and what's happening with education and public education is no different. And what's happening here is we have the federal government kind of dangling hardworking people's tax dollars over our heads and sort of declaring, do you want to keep food on the tables for your families? Do you want your schools to keep the lights on? Do you want your local hospitals to be equipped with the best tools and staff that money can buy? And they've said, well, you can't have any of that until we've erased or heavily discriminated against this entire segment of our population. And what we have seen in the last 3 weeks is the transgender community and our families being pitted between our neighbors and the services they need to get by, simply being called in some instances an enemy within. And so here we're talking about in public schools, the 13-year-old trans girl who wears cute dresses and has posters of Chapel Roan on her wall, who paints her nails instead of playing football, who speaks softly and loves endlessly. And this is who we're calling the enemy within. I don't think I'd ever considered that the enemy within would be equipped with teenage angst and face glitter, and I'm not sure how we got here. I'm not sure how we're signaling that our economy will be stronger if we can discriminate against her. I'm not sure how we got here to say that our national defense depends on her not being able to hang out with her friends on a soccer field 3 days per week. And I'm not sure how we got to a point where we said our math scores across the country will improve if we make her use the boys' bathroom. And really, this is just bullying. It is the full weight of the United States government being slammed down on these families and their children. And I know, look, I empathize. It's hard for some folks to understand what it means to be transgender, what it's like to be transgender, especially if you have never met someone before. But like every other young person in our society, transgender and LGBTQ young people broadly will have the best opportunity to thrive when they are supported and loved. And for trans and gender nonconforming young people, that means getting access to the healthcare they need. It means not being told they can't use the restroom. And it means calling them by the name that they ask you to call them. That love and support is tied to exponentially better physical and emotional health outcomes. Trans people are real. The healthcare we receive today is the result of us being real and not the other way around. And our institutions, like schools, have adapted to reflect this advancement in our society that better understands science and better understands each other. We've come to understand that allowing a transgender young person to use the restroom of the gender they live as is the policy that keeps all of our employees safe, all of our customers safe, and all of our students safe. We are not here to hurt anyone. We are just here to exist. We are asking and need the country's empathy right now. And I believe public schools embody so much of the foundation of how this version of society should function, where a kindergartner steps into a classroom for the first time and is confronted with curiosity like they've never been confronted with it before, where kids just don't learn how to read, they learn how to create. And like my experience was growing up in public schools, they learned how to listen, they learned how to analyze, and we learn how to empathize. It's where they meet kids whose parents did things a little differently than their parents, or whose parents even look a little different. And nobody has their thumb on the scale when you're in the walls of a public school. Nobody is playing God. Nobody is deciding who gets to be here and who doesn't. Nobody is deciding who you are. That's for you to figure out. It's a place of uninterrupted growth, reflection, and learning without a political agenda. And I think we must find a way here to stand up for both that institution as well as all the children's and family it services. Because philosophically and historically, it doesn't matter which group is being made to be the scapegoat as transgender people have made to be. What matters is that any group at all is being made a scapegoat. If our institutions and our leaders don't stand up to this, I promise you, it does not end at transgender people. We are setting a precedent that one person unilaterally has the authority to decide who deserves employment, who deserves education, who deserves healthcare, and who deserves what kind of healthcare, regardless of what laws have been enacted democratically by a bicameral legislature and its governor. If we cement that precedent, it has dangerous consequences to independent public education, to civil liberties, to freedom of speech, and to the institution we call democracy. Trans people right now are the canaries in the coal mine. We are fighting for our basic dignity and existence in a way that if America, our fellow Americans, do not come to help us, many more folks will end up having to fight alone when it's their turn.
Thank you so much, MA. I appreciate you sharing so openly, and also standing up for the LGBTQ community and also sharing a little bit about your own story. So thank you. Next, I'm going to pass it to Sandra Ducky. She is the president of Ferndale Public Schools Board of Education, and also she has a little bit of an announcement about some things that other board members across Michigan have done in collaboration with Michigan Education Justice Coalition. So I'm going to pass it to Sandra. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Imani. As you stated, my name is Sandra Dukie. I'm the president of Ferndale Public Schools Board of Education, located here in Southern Oakland County. School district governance boards look to the Department of Ed for policy guidance on not only educating, but also protecting our students, and to set standards and funding for school districts to ensure our students receive the best education. While the history of the department in these areas may not be stellar, closing the Department of Education will cause a ripple effect we can't even begin to understand, as demonstrated by the ongoing release of executive orders. These harmful federal policies have real-world consequences, and our children will bear the heaviest burden. In Ferndale, we stand to face cuts to Title I, Head Start, GSRP, adult education, school lunch, and IDEA or special education. We need the Department of Education to uphold students' most basic civil rights. In Ferndale, we continue to stand together to safeguard the rights of all students, but we need our elected officials to stand up for our students. We must stand together and push back against these funding cuts, or our collective voices are stronger together. I'm proud to stand with MEJC and announce today that we have collectively gathered over 60 school board members' signatures from across the state that have signed a letter demanding to protect the Department of Education and safeguard our democracy. We plan to send this letter to the entire Michigan congressional delegation, and then we will hand deliver this letter to the 3 congressional leaders who sit on the Education Committee in the U.S. Congress: Lisa McClain, Haley Stevens, and the chair himself of the Education Committee, Tim Walberg. We hope you will join us as we tell our leaders to put our children first and hold strong against dismantling our public education system that services over 80% of children nationwide. We need a strong Department of Education to provide strong schools to help our students with disabilities, students of families with low income, undocumented, and LGBTQ youth. Every child deserves an education that will prepare them for success in school and beyond. We refuse to prioritize the desires of billionaires over the well-being of our children.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Oh, let me turn my camera on. Thank you so much, Sandra. I am so excited about you guys getting so many signatures. That's great. I think it's going to be a great action. And if you all want to learn more about that, please check out the MEJC website. I believe it's My Ed Justice, but if someone can throw the website in the chat or the link for folks to register to be a part of your action, I think that would be a great next step. All right. So last but certainly not least for our speakers, and before we get into our Q&A, I want to introduce you all to Monet Harris, an amazing 482Forward parent organizer and parent in general. I'm very excited for y'all to get to hear a little bit from her about this, how this legislation can impact not only our students across the city, across the state, but also individually on an individual level. So thank you for joining us, Monet, and I'm going to give the mic to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Imani, for the introduction. Again, my name is Monet Harris. I am a graduate of DPS, which is now DPS-CD. I'm a proud parent of Detroit high schooler and a proud parent organizer of 482Forward. My thought process, the dismantling of the Department of Education Foundation could place what is already a scarcely funding and shortfall in our services, almost to a complete desert of the availability of funding and services, especially to our schools. The Department of Education has rules and regulations which each state must follow and adhere to before funds are distributed and dispersed. And to dismantle this could prove disastrous to our schools. And so without this oversight and funding needed to support programs that's under the Elementary Secondary Education Act or the Individuals with Disabilities Act, they're at stake. See, I know firsthand the positive impact that these acts have had on my life. Being hearing impaired, I would have never received what I needed to be successful in school. And my son having ADHD, not only the allotment of more time to take tests, but mechanisms set in place for him to also learn his full capacity. Now, if you can imagine the space of being hearing impaired and struggling to balance and discipline ourselves with ADHD, we were labeled as disciplinary issues. And we already know without certain programs availability that being a disciplinarian could also lead to another funnel, which we are fully aware of. That is why here at 482Forward, a coalition where we stand to fight and ensure that every student graduates fully engaged and equipped to be a positive impact on their community. We are gathering parents and students, educators to support us in our push for quality education for all students. And not just a story of myself. I want to hear more stories about how individuals overcame, especially dealing with situations where programs may be lacked. That's why the Department of Education and its fundamental principles must still be intact. So to help us, we invite you to visit 482forward.org to get information, because we must push this thing all the way through for our future and for our babies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monet, for sharing. I'm not sure if y'all caught that, but Monet is also a poet. It shows she's really good, right, with the words. I caught that though, Monet, and thank you so much for all your alliteration and just giving us some insight to exactly how this can impact people on a personal level. All right, now probably the part that a lot of you have been waiting for. I'm going to pass it to Molly Sweeney, who is the director of 482Forward. And she is going to give us a Q&A. She's going to give us a few of the top questions, as many as we have time for. We have this scheduled until noon, so hopefully we can get to them all. And then panelists, I think there are some that are directed to panelists and others that are general. So if you just want to kind of pop in. But before we get started, I think we also added Pamela Pugh to the panelist list.
Pamela, the school board president is in the chat. Pamela, if you would like to join as a panelist, I can upgrade you.
Yes,
If you have any questions.
Yeah.
So there are 3 questions. They are all in the same vein. So one is from Gongware and one is from Detroit Free Press. The questions are all centered, and Dr. Rice, one is directed towards you, but also anyone that's interested. They're directed towards the president moving towards an executive order or federal legislation that would expand school voucher programs, as well as the potential of a bill going through the House of Representatives in Michigan that would trigger any school district with 50%, where's Kara's question, sorry, 50% or more students attending charters, that it would trigger that they be privatized. So the questions are really structured on what can we in Michigan do to stop the expanding school voucher programs and privatization?
Well, the Constitution, our state Constitution, doesn't permit voucher programs. And I don't see the Constitution changing anytime soon. So that's number one. Number two, if the president wants to convince Congress to put funding into vouchers, he might induce certain states to come aboard as a result of that. I don't see him convincing the state of Michigan to do so. I don't think that the legislature will go along with that. And at the end of the day, I certainly don't think the citizens are going to set aside their Constitution. The reality is that vouchers have not been linked to higher student achievement in public education across the country. And it's unclear why anyone would think that they would be linked to higher student achievement in Michigan if implemented here.
Can I also add on to that as
Go ahead,
well?
Regina.
So this directive was part of the quote unquote ending radical indoctrination in K-12 schooling executive order that came out at the end of January. and directed federal officials to reappropriate money that has already been appropriated, which is also unconstitutional, but to identify funding that could be used for voucher systems. To Superintendent Rice's point, we are prohibited in doing that in Michigan per the state constitution. But the concern that I have there more broadly is, again, we are talking about potentially reappropriating dollars that either are already being used for critical services that we know that we need, or could potentially be put towards increasing funding for special education services and other kinds of services at the federal level that are now being talked about sending out to states through a voucher program, which we in Michigan cannot use anyway, because again, it is unconstitutional. So dollars that we are paying in our taxes to the federal government not coming back to Michigan is what we are talking about, and what it is potentially at risk when you talk about implementing a more federal voucher program, and how that could impact Michigan. And again, it's just fewer dollars getting into the classroom. And to Dr. Rice's point, in states where we have seen these voucher programs rolled out, we have not seen improvements in educational outcomes. It's actually increased achievement gaps. And we need to put money where we know that it works, and that it's directly back into the classroom, and then it's directly back into servicing the students across the board, and particularly giving extra supports to students who have additional needs.
I can add to this as a community act organizer. So 482 Forward has been tracking the potential privatization and voucher conversations closely, because it's been something, as Detroiters we're very well aware of, has been a clear tactic for cities like Detroit. And I'll say this, as community organizers, like we're not afraid to also file lawsuits with anyone else who's willing to continue to protect Michigan's Constitution for our public dollars continuing to go to public schools. And we've done that before under the Snyder administration, and we're very ready and willing to do that again if IDA funding or Title I or any of those important federal dollars are trying to push through a voucher system in Michigan. And just to reiterate, like Rep. Weiss says, and Dr. Rice, across the country, data has proven that privatizing education does not work. Vouchers actually don't serve the students who are the most at need, special education students, students often in Title I districts. And so we are very clear that we will do all we can as a collective to protect our public education. All right.
Yeah, I see another question from Chalkbeat. Or let me see. Okay, I'll answer from Chalkbeat and then I'll scroll down. So, can you talk about the impact of Trump's push to withhold money from schools teaching discriminatory equity ideology? I'm thinking maybe if we can answer like, what could that mean? What could that look like? And then also like from a statewide standpoint, is that possible? Is that legal?
I can jump in here just to start. This was again from that same executive order. I will say when I'm a former history teacher, social studies teacher from Detroit. And when I read that executive order, it actually made me cry, because I taught US history, and I don't know how you teach US history and follow what this executive order is saying to do. Because it's essentially trying to whitewash all of our history is what it is intending to do, and not talk about the history of African Americans, of Asian Americans, the history of people with disabilities, of women, of the LGBTQ community, and a Native American community, and all of the different diverse tapestry and backgrounds that are not just about teaching African American history or Asian American history or women's history, but about teaching history, period. And I don't know how you do that if you follow this executive order. And so I don't believe that there is, in my opinion, real teeth to this executive order in terms of preventing that from happening. And our attorney general has said as much. Like, she is not sending out, there are not going to be people coming after teachers for teaching history and doing these sorts of things. So from this executive order in of itself, I think this is more political posturing and creating fear. However, I am concerned about attempts to limit potential future federal funding if districts, teachers, attempt to just simply teach actual history, including the curriculum that has already been adopted by every single school district in the state.
So to add to that, and I agree with what Rep Weiss said, but to add to that, we ought to be about teaching not simply about the soaring moments, but the searing moments of our history. And those searing moments include about race and racism. They include about sexism. They include about homophobia and transphobia. They include about assaults on our indigenous communities. All of that is a part of our history in the United States. And we should be teaching about the full breadth of our history. We shouldn't be narrowing our teaching of history. We should be broadening our teaching of history. And there are tremendous efforts that are going on right now, from the department's effort to expand the teaching of comprehensive history through professional development of social studies and history, government staff. But in addition to that, efforts in the state legislature to broaden what young people learn about all sorts of people in public schools. We shouldn't narrow the teaching. We should broaden it. It should not be whitewashed. It should fully reflect the breadth of our humanity in the country.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, Emmy Zanotti from Equality Michigan Action Network again. I agree with everything that State Superintendent has said and everything Representative Weiss has said here. And I do also want to say, in defense of teaching the real history, right, is I want to defy any myths and misinformation that's it's some way not reflective of being patriotic, right? I think when we look at the struggles of these communities to build themselves up from not even having some basic human rights into being integrated and embedded of every aspect of our society and starting to strive toward equality and even equity, I think that's the real American story I think we should be telling people. That's the sort of thing that I think inspires us. And I grew up in a working class household. My dad was a foundry worker, UAW, right? My mom worked in and out of jobs and took care of us in the meantime at home and babysat other people's kids for extra pocket change for us to help put food on the table. And they had 3 kids, right, who went on and got college degrees, and I do this, and I have a sister who's in accounting, and we're doing all of these things. And I think that's the same story we're telling, right? Like, people who had an opportunity and seized it in this country and did so via all of the legal pathways, right? Passing laws through democratically elected legislatures, building relationships with their neighbors and their teachers and their doctors, and helping educate broader society and what it means to be inclusive and understanding, and not just sort of like taking some unilateral action that thrusts one perspective on everyone at once, right? I think that's like what marginalized communities have done to carve out more space for themselves in this society should be the story we're telling right now about what patriotism is, what American prosperity is, what American opportunity is. And so I think we've done a real disservice sometimes in the media of the way we frame diversity, equity, and inclusion. But the reality is that that's what it is. It's highlighting the accomplishments that all Americans have done for this country to make this a better place.
We are patriots. This group of people are patriots. We're protecting our people. I see a question from Shayla Griffin. How does the federal ban on DEI impact schools' DEI efforts if they receive title funding, and what we think what might happen?
So the answer is currently not at all. The question is, what is the other shoe that might fall?
And I think that just goes back to the point that we have been making this entire point, and it's not just DEI, but especially in what Emmy has been talking about in protecting trans kids and trans rights here in Michigan, and LGBTQ rights here in Michigan. We've already seen efforts from hospital systems announcing that they're going to no longer provide gender affirming care moving forward because of fears of what's happening at the federal level. Just the threat of some of these things are already starting to have real impacts here in Michigan. I've heard there's students right now who come from mixed immigration background who are afraid to go to school Again, just because the fear of what is being talked about and what is happening at the federal level, that fear alone is having real impacts. But right now, there's no legal standing to enforce or to pull back title dollars from districts who are using DEI initiatives. But to Dr. Rice's point, absolutely, we are incredibly worried about what that could mean moving forward in the next budget.
Can I just piggyback on that? And that the fear and the unknown is the reason that we all need to come together, which is the reason why I appreciate MEJC helping get the word out. If you want to know how to help, you need to get to your, I mean, school boards are an underused elected body that has a voice. And if we come together now and start collectively pushing and making our voice heard, we can help prohibit some of these things from actually going into effect, right? Actually becoming law, actually having teeth. Right now, it's just fear and the unknown. It's a lot of smoke. And so I think now is the time for us to act before the smoke actually turns into fire.
Thank
Right,
you.
then-
Oh, sorry.
Oh, and the next question is from the Free Press. Can you guys talk a little bit more about where your concerns over special education funding are coming from?
Well, special education has historically been underfunded. And that's not just my opinion, although it is my opinion. It's very clearly noted. The Fed's in not a single year in the last half century since the passage of the Education for All Handicapped Act, Public Law 94, 142 in 1975. The Feds have never funded 20%. It's a fair bit lower than that now. They've never ascended to their pledge of 40%. And this is a president who has made very clear that he's going to slash government spending. He came in and he immediately paused all education spending. Now, the pause was lifted, but it was lifted because of 2 federal lawsuits. It wasn't lifted because of any epiphany on his part. So I think that we should be very concerned about all education programs. I think when someone tells you who they are, I think we should believe them.
And I
think
mean,
there's-
and
oh. Go ahead, Regina.
sorry, and let's just be honest, special education funding is an example of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. We want to make sure that every child gets access to what they need to be successful. That is about inclusion. And this administration has made it very clear that they want to go after every single thing that we could interpret as a DEI program. Well, who is impacted by that? I think people assume when they hear DEI that that's mostly impacting Black and Brown and minority communities, which of course will be impacted by that. But the majority, just as an example, the majority of people who are quote unquote DEI hires are white women and people in rural communities often. And so this is impacting not just Detroit. These sorts of measures are going to impact every single community here in Michigan, every single school district, every single family. And so we have to be very honest about what it means to go after quote unquote DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and what that could mean for students with disabilities, what that could mean for students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and who ultimately is going to suffer as a result of that. And the answer is all of us.
So there's 2 other questions. Lily from the Free Press also asked, I have heard changes to the Office of Civil Rights already impacting ongoing investigations. Are there avenues for parents that parents can take through the state level to fight alleged discrimination?
Well, it depends on which discrimination in what form, but there are several avenues. One avenue is through the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. So that's an important avenue. Another avenue is up through the chain of command at the local school district, and to your local school board. The third is through the department. Again, depending upon what form of discrimination you're referring to. And then the fourth is local law enforcement. It depends upon the specific form of discrimination. But those are all avenues for redressing discrimination.
Another question, can you share examples of how programs have already been impacted by Trump's announcement? Have any Head Start programs here in Michigan had issues with the canceled funding pause from a few weeks ago?
So a couple of things. One, if I recall correctly, he announced the pause on a Sunday, and by Monday close of business, he had already been subjected to 2 lawsuits, and there had been a pause on the pause in federal grants and loans going out. So it wasn't that there was a very long period of time where this presidential executive order was in place without federal courts setting it aside temporarily. So that's number one. Two, we heard that there were challenges from local Head Start centers in accessing the federal portal for funding. But we believe that that got taken care of pretty quickly, again, likely because of the action of plaintiffs in those 2 federal lawsuits. I might add, Michigan is party to the lawsuit, 22 state lawsuit, pushing back against the president and saying you cannot pause federal grants and loans. That is not legal. And a judge has agreed with us. That pause has been paused, and we're waiting for final determination in that case. Attorney General Nessel has also led another suit against the president on the issue of birthright citizenship and that executive order. So there are efforts currently legally to push back against these actions.
All right, thank you so much, Michael Rice. We so appreciate all of you hopping on this call. And just one more time for everybody that may have joined late, anything like that, this was a press conference that was planned in partnership with 482Forward, which is a coalition that does education justice work across the city of Detroit, with the Michigan Education Justice Coalition, a coalition of many different organizations across the state that fight for our schools across the state, and also Progress Michigan, who really did so much help just getting us all together with the media, helping us get prepped, helping us make sure we're all under one narrative. If you take one thing from today, what we want to tell you is that all of these people, right? Community organization, parents, educators, teachers unions, all of us are united and standing strong in the fact that we are committed to a future where every student receives exactly what they need, whether they are our most vulnerable, whether they are our least vulnerable. This is just a start for us, right? We're not backing down. We will fight together to continue to protect our funding and all of our children. We have a collective of legislators, educators, parents, state superintendent here, state representative Regina Weiss. We're so grateful for all of you standing with us. And we want everyone to know that this is just the beginning. This is not the end. And thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to pass it to Molly and Regina and Michael to see if y'all have anything else to share, and then we will close out.
I think the only thing that I hope the press takes away is that we're a united front in Michigan, and that we're not backing down, that we believe that all of our students, everyone, every single one of them deserves all of the funding, all of the services, all of the history. And that, when we talk about patriotic education, that is what Michael Rice described, is we want to teach the searing history. We want to teach the real history. We want our kids in Michigan to be proud of who they are, and that we are going to continue to monitor the federal government and make sure that we have responses together from our teachers unions, our electeds, our school board leaders, our local activists, and our state superintendent to say that, we are here, we're not going away. And that every student should know that there are collective adults across the state standing together.
Thanks, Molly. Yep, go ahead, Regina.
Thank you. Thank you, Amani. Thank you, Molly. Thank you to everyone on this call. And kind of just building off of what Molly said, I would be remiss if I didn't get back on my history teacher soapbox for a minute to just say that, every lesson, every year, the very first lesson I would always teach my students in a history class was about historiography. which sounds really complicated and like, what are you talking about? But the very first thing I would always tell my students is there are multiple ways that you can look at any issue. There are multiple lenses through which you can interpret any single event, and even just choosing which events that you talk about and don't talk about in history. History is heavily curated, and people are constantly making decisions, often political decisions, on what is and is not covered in that history. And that is about teaching critical thinking. That is about teaching understanding the diverse perspectives, and also understanding how the world is and came to be the way it is, and why certain things exist the way that they do. And without having the ability, teachers having the ability to teach through that sort of critical lens, we run the risk of not only damaging the identities and perspectives of folks from diverse perspectives in this country, in this state, but everyone deserves to be able to think critically and make up their own decisions, and not be told and mandated what is and isn't, and what should and should not be. They deserve to be able to learn diverse perspectives and make their own decisions. And I ran for this position because of my students, because I wanted to make sure that we were moving Michigan in the right direction, to make sure that we are serving every child in the state. I'm really proud of a lot of the work that we've done over the past few years to move in the right direction. And I myself, and I know everyone on this call, will not back down to federal threats. And we will make sure that we are doing everything in our power to make sure that children here in Michigan are protected, that their rights are protected, and that they continue to have the resources that they need to thrive and be successful.
Thank you so much, State Rep Regina Weiss. And I think it's just such a testament that you are somebody that's an elected official that was once in the classroom. Those are the people that we want to be making decisions about our schools, because we know that you will fight with us, right? And not for us or against us, but with us. Thank you so much. Anything else from you, State Superintendent Michael Rice?
So the fight about the U.S. Department of Education is a fight about program protections for children. It's about student protections. It's about defending our children. Our children's futures are on the line. Moreover, the fight about the U.S. Department of Education ultimately is going to be about who decides what gets taught in public schools. This is just the initial shot across the bow. There will be other shots across the bow, and then there will be shots that won't be across the bow at all. There will be more direct shots. If you truly believe in local and state control of public education, then you want to teach the broadest swath of history. You want to teach about all Michiganders and all people in this country. The history is rich, it is complicated, it is complex, it does not distill simply. And patriotism is not singing from a single hymnal. Patriotism is acknowledging that this country has had many, many powerful moments, some of which are tremendously pride-inducing, but others of which should engender a measure of sadness, a tremendous measure of sadness. And anyone who denies this isn't focused on the 13th Amendment, the end of slavery. How can you teach the Constitution without teaching the constitutional amendments? How can you teach the constitutional amendments without teaching about the end of slavery? How can you teach about the end of slavery without teaching about slavery? How can you teach about slavery without teaching about race and racism? Slavery, the foundation of slavery is that one group of people is superior to another. That's racism. You can't teach about slavery without teaching about racism. You can't teach about the Constitution without teaching about racism. Now, there are 1,000 other themes there as well. But all we say is, don't whitewash the history. Teach it all. Teach it in its full breadth. And don't talk about cutting the U.S. Department of Education. We know what that means. We know that means cutting dollars to our school children. It means cutting protections to our school children. It means reducing the opportunities for our young people as they grow up. Thank you.
Thank you so, so, so much, Dr. Michael Rice. Amazing way for us to close this out. The only thing that I have left to say is Happy Black History Month. I hope that you all are finding a way to celebrate in a way that is efficient, helpful, and educational to you. We will stay on for a few, just the panelists, anybody who wants to stay on, and everyone else. Thank you for joining us.